Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 37 of History for Shut-ins. Today, we're going to talk about William Tecumseh Sherman, his taking of Atlanta, the March to the Sea, and the Carolinas campaign. In early May of 1864, forces under Sherman began battling the Confederate Army of Tennessee. At stake is Atlanta, a major manufacturing center and railroad hub for the Confederacy. Sherman had 110,000 men in three armies around Chattanooga, Tennessee. Facing them at Dalton, Georgia, 80 miles north of Atlanta, Joseph E. Johnston had 54,000 men, so a little bit less than half. Within the month, the Confederates received 15,000 reinforcements, making Johnston's army at the time the Confederacy's largest. Remember, going on at this time is the Overland Campaign. You've got Lee and Grant doing their thing. So, despite the large numbers, Johnston's plan hinged on taking a strong defensive position, waiting for Sherman to attack. And we will see in the long run that ruffles the feathers of Jefferson Davis and ends up getting Johnston replaced. Sherman enjoys numerical superiority, but he did not use it in frontal attacks as Grant had been doing against Lee in Virginia. Instead, he used Major General George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland and Major General John Schofield's Army of the Ohio to demonstrate against Confederate lines, while he sent Major General James B. McPherson's Army of the Tennessee to maneuver around Johnston's left flank and threaten his supply line, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. No spoilers for the Grant miniseries on the History Channel. That's why we're talking about Sherman today, as episode number 3 runs tonight. Great series, by the way. Even better book by Ron Chernow on Grant. I highly recommend it. So this worked. The Union plans worked throughout the campaign, beginning at Rocky Face Ridge, where Johnston retreated on May 12th. While the two armies traded short, sharp attacks at Resaca on May 14th and 15th, McPherson crossed the Oostenaula River. Johnston retreats again. After Johnston's failed attempt to attack Sherman at Cassville on the 19th of May, the front shifted across the Etowah River to the area of Dallas, New Hope Church, and Pickett's Mill in Georgia, where inconclusive fighting occurred May 25th through May 28th. Johnston dug in at Kennesaw Mountain, repelling Sherman's assaults on June 27th before being flanked again. Approaching the Chattahoochee River, Sherman feinted right and got troops across upstream. The Confederates retreated towards Atlanta on July 9th and July 10th of 1864. Alarmed at Johnston's loss of territory and his failure to attack Sherman, Davis relieves Johnston and replaces him with Lieutenant General John Bell Hood on the 18th of July, by which time Union forces of about 80,000 were 5 miles outside of Atlanta. Johnston is replaced by Hood. Sherman is thrilled because he knows that Hood will be more aggressive. By being more aggressive, Hood is going to lose men faster, which will make Sherman's taking of Atlanta and march to the sea happen much more quickly. When Sherman begins on his march toward Atlanta, they are basically the lost army. Nobody knows where they are. Nobody is giving word. Sherman is not sharing his plans with The press. Sherman has a great line about the press, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if I told the press that I was going to hell, the devil would know before the morning. So Sherman does not trust the press. He's not the first military man or the last to distrust the press. So he's keeping his plans very quiet. Hood has an army of 50,000 pinned inside Atlanta's fortifications. They faced very difficult odds, but Hood fulfilled the Confederate government administration's wish that Atlanta not be given up without a fight. On July 20th, Hood successfully attacked Thomas's army north of Atlanta at Peachtree Creek. On July 22nd, east of Atlanta, Hood sent Lieutenant General William J. Hardee's corps in a flank attack. Union Army Commander McPherson is killed in action, and this is the bloodiest battle of the campaign. Although Hood came closer to victory than at any other time, the Confederates were repulsed by Sherman's forces. McPherson is a favorite of Grant and Sherman. They have a special ceremony to commemorate him after he is killed. Sherman did not intend to assault the strong earthworks surrounding Atlanta. He wanted to capture the city by cutting its railroads and starving Hood out, much like Grant was doing at Petersburg, much like Grant had done at Vicksburg. And Sherman is thinking it's almost like an anaconda. I'm going to squeeze them out. I'm going to cut down their supply lines, and then I'm going to starve them out of Atlanta. Union troops had cut the line running east to Augusta, and cavalry in Alabama had damaged the line to Montgomery. Only the Macon and Western Railroad kept Hood supplied. Sherman's movements west of the city to cut that railroad led to battles at Ezra Church on July 28th and Utoy Creek August 5th through August 7th. As Hood was extending his lines during August of 1864, Sherman's artillery bombarded the city and its several thousand remaining residents. So remember, as Hood is extending his lines, he doesn't have reinforcements to fill in the gaps, much like Lee in Virginia, whereas Sherman has much more at his disposal. Federal cavalry raids aimed at cutting the Macon and Western Railroad failed. Around this time, Hood sent Major General Joseph Wheeler and his cavalry into North Georgia and Tennessee to cut Sherman's rail lines. They also failed. Finally, on August 25th, Sherman sent most of his infantry corps on a wide swing toward Jonesboro, 17 miles south of Atlanta, determined to cut the railroad. Union troops reached it on August 31st. With their arrival and victory there, the last lifeline to Atlanta is effectively cut. Hood is forced to abandon Atlanta on September 1st. Atlanta surrenders to federal forces on the morning of September 2nd. Hood then decides to go north through Georgia, through Tennessee, in hopes of drawing Sherman away from Atlanta and away from the deeper Confederacy. Sherman responds by, I will give him and his men provisions until they hit the Shenandoah Valley. My work is down here, and we're going to talk about that shortly. Battle casualties for the 4-month campaign to take Atlanta totaled 35,000 for the Union and 35,000 for the Confederacy. Sherman's capture of Atlanta is a major blow, almost a death blow, but not quite, to the Confederacy, and it all but assures Lincoln's reelection 2 months later, setting the stage for what we're going to talk about next, the March to the Sea. The March to the Sea used destructive war to convince Confederate citizens that they could not win the war and that the Confederate government could not protect them. In this respect, Sherman is truly one of the first modern generals. He understands that if you go after those things that support the army, the infrastructure, supplies, citizenry. If you take that away from the army, you will kill the army more effectively or more completely than simply attacking the army. Sherman wanted to convey that the Confederates controlled their own fate. If they remained in rebellion, they would suffer. Once they surrendered, he would be much more generous to them. Think of, and again, we're going to talk about it in the March to the Sea here, but there are very few civilian casualties, unlike the bombing of London or Berlin or Dresden in World War II, or quite frankly, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sherman is not concerned with killing civilians, he's concerned with everything else that can support the Confederate Army. In Atlanta, Sherman instituted tactics that American war leaders would use in World War II, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. In these later conflicts, largely through the use of air power, which of course Sherman does not have here, America attempted to destroy the enemy's will and logistics on the ground and in a much smaller scale. Sherman pioneered the process. He is called the U.S. father of total warfare, a sign of psychological tactics that would be used into the next and beyond the next century. 2 months after capturing Atlanta, Sherman was ready to move out and strip the city of its military infrastructure. In preparations, he moved the few people remaining in Atlanta, about 2,000, out of the area and cut his own supply line. This freed his troops for the upcoming March to the Sea, rather than relegating a significant number for logistical duty, guarding supply trains and such. It meant that the men would need to live off the land. From Atlanta, Sherman would set out across the southern heartland toward the coast, eventually turning north to pin Lee's army between his troops and Grant's. Sherman's a fascinating guy. The route to the sea was not open. Sherman had to contend with the Confederate army of John Bell Hood. Sherman proposed to split his Union force, taking 62,000 of his best troops on a destructive march, while Major General George H. Thomas used the remainder of his forces to contain Hood. Lincoln and Grant wanted Sherman to destroy the Confederate army first and then initiate his psychological war of destruction. Sherman prevailed upon Grant, who then prevailed or convinced Lincoln. Grant said that he would not have allowed anyone other than Sherman to attempt such a march. So it shows you, we talked about this in our class at the end of last week. The relationship between Grant and Sherman and Lincoln. They trusted each other implicitly and they all understood their roles. Sherman knew that Grant was driving the bus, so to speak, militarily, and Grant knew that he reported to Lincoln, although Lincoln deferred heavily to Grant in areas of military tactics because they're on the same page. We need to destroy the Confederacy. On November 15th, 62,000 men split into two infantry wings, four parallel corps columns with screening cavalry to protect the main bodies as they spread across the land, left Atlanta. Not all of the destruction was Sherman's doing. One third of city buildings were in ruins as a result of entrenchments dug by the Confederates and the detonation of ammunition performed as part of Hood's evacuation. Although the Union destroyed Atlanta's war-making potential and used artillery to bombard the city before taking it, 400 houses were standing when Sherman left. Pardon me one second. We're getting a little air into the History for Shut-ins classroom here. Sherman wanted to keep his movements as secret as possible. He cut telegraph lines to prevent intelligence from reaching the Confederates or his superiors in Washington, D.C. Although Sherman told his officers and troops little about his plans, they grasped the basic purpose of the march and were unconcerned about the lack of details. Georgia, which is now open before Sherman, was the largest Confederate state. It had some large plantations, but many more small farms. Well known to Sherman from his study of the 1860 census, Georgia's fertile soil still held potential to feed the Confederacy. Sherman knew that they could live off the Georgia land. Confederate troops blocking Sherman were few and weak. Lieutenant General William J. Hardee commanded the undermanned Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Major General Gustavus Smith led a small Georgia state militia. The most potent Confederate force in the state was Joseph Wheeler's 3,500-man cavalry, which managed to harass Sherman but was too small to pose a deadly threat. From the outset, Sherman's men destroyed tunnels and bridges with particular effort to make railroad tracks unusable. The approach was hard, back-breaking work, but simple. Rails were torn from the ties, which were stacked to make a bonfire beneath them. Once the rails became red hot, they were twisted into what came to be known as Sherman's neckties. Basically, almost like a memorial ribbon that you see today that people wear on their collars or lapels or such. The campaign's chief engineer, Colonel Orlando Poe, devised specialized equipment called cant hooks, C-A-N-T, for the task. Sherman's soldiers embraced his Special Field Order 120, which required every brigade to organize a foraging detachment with the goal of keeping a consistent 3-day supply of gathered foodstuffs. Not only was Sherman's army larger and really just spreading and superior to the Confederate military, Sherman outmaneuvered the few Confederate forces and kept them uncertain about his destination. He fooled the Confederates into believing that one part of his army was heading toward Augusta, while the other wing was heading for Macon, Georgia. His true destination was the Georgia capital of Milledgeville. Wheeler's cavalry, Confederate cavalry, tried to hinder Sherman, but Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick's 5,000 Union horse soldiers cleared it out of the way. Confederate political and military leaders all fell for the ruse. None of them saw Sherman going to Milledgeville. The only real combat took place on November 22nd near Griswoldville. The militia, temporarily under the inexperienced command of Brigadier General Pleasant Phillips, came upon part of Sherman's rear guard, about 1,700 men. Not realizing that the Union had repeating rifles and were dug in, Phillips ordered an attack. The Confederates were overwhelmed. The Union discovered at the time that the Confederates are really, no offense meant, scraping the bottom of the barrel, as the attackers are old men and young boys. It's because the cream of the crop of the Confederacy is fighting up north, or quite frankly, has been killed. Sherman kept marching. To the Confederate surprise, he bypassed Augusta and entered Confederate politician and Brigadier General Hal Cobb's plantation 10 miles outside Milledgeville, his true destination. Milledgeville panics. The state legislature increased, or actually extended, the existing draft to include men from 16 to 65 years of age. Prisoners in state jail willing to take up arms were freed, although some burned down the jail rather than report for duty. Politicians hurried to escape the city. Civilians were infuriated when Sherman's men celebrated Thanksgiving in Milledgeville and reenacted a legislative session to vote Georgia back into the Union. The Union damaged state buildings and destroyed books and manuscripts before leaving Milledgeville on November 24th. Sherman has now been marching for a week. The Army moved at a steady pace, covering as much as 15 miles a day. African Americans and white pioneers cleared the path ahead, with Sherman joining in the work. The men ate whenever and whatever they could. When they reached the assigned campsite in the evening, each man hooked his tent half to the tent next to his, pitched it, and prepared the only full meal of the day over a fire. So they're basically marching and eating as they go. The one joke or story told is that, Sherman's army said that they could kill, gut, and eat a pig without breaking formation. Soldiers entertained themselves by letter writing and card games, but the favorite activity was to hear the adventures of the foragers, those who went out before the army to gather everything. As the main columns were marching all day, soldiers and others fanned out in all directions, not only looking for food, but for treasures. These foragers, which were called bummers, did the most damage to the countryside and provided the most food for the troops. They wandered out 5+ miles from the main columns and found hidden food, horses, wagons, slaves, treasures, what have you. Operating under varying degrees of supervision, their exploits formed the foundation of Sherman's lasting reputation. Whether it was a plantation manor, modest dwelling, or slave hut, every residence stood a chance of being ransacked. Barns, gardens, and farms were overrun. Although many houses were damaged, others were left untouched, an unpredictability that became a source of great fear. Again, the psychological warfare. When Joe Wheeler's horsemen began destroying property and looting, shock of Confederates abusing their own was hard for Georgia civilians to take. In denial, they accused Sherman of carrying out countless acts. So Sherman was everywhere at once, doing everything. As he grew in the Confederate imagination, rumors about where he was and what he did were quote unquote fact. Increased terror intensified the impact of his march to the sea, all of which is what suited Sherman and his goals. As the marching progressed, the Union attracted ex-slaves more and more, who greeted the Union as emancipators. Although he considered slaves inferior, Sherman treated them with courtesy, shaking hands and gleaning their knowledge of the area. While many African Americans became laborers and performed tasks necessary to the advance, others simply followed in the wake of the columns. This caused Sherman, who was trying to move quickly and live off the land, to worry about their impact on his speed and supply of food meant for his soldiers. Acting as a rear guard for the Army on December 9th, 1864, the Union, under command of Major General Jefferson C. Davis, ironic, were crossing the flooded Ebenezer Creek on a pontoon bridge. The long line of 650 fugitive slaves was ordered to await a signal before crossing. As the last unit of Davis's rear guard reached the far side, the bridge was unlashed. The pontoons floated away, leaving the slaves unable to cross. Knowing that the Confederate cavalry was nearby, the fugitives, fearful of being captured and killed or re-enslaved, panicked. They jumped into the water trying to swim across. Seeing their terror, some Union soldiers began throwing logs and anything they could find toward the drowning fugitives or slaves. Although some were saved on makeshift rafts or by soldiers who waded into the creek, many drowned or were captured by the Confederates. Davis took a great deal of blame for this incident, but Sherman defended him. He blamed the ex-slave refugees for ignoring his advice not to follow the Union Army. 2 weeks after this incident, the march ended in Savannah. Sherman's army reached the sea, took Fort McAllister, and retied itself to a naval supply line. On December 25th, the Union captured Savannah. Sherman sends a telegraph to Lincoln saying that Savannah is yours as a Christmas gift. Sherman allowed Hardee's army to escape the city, although he could have very easily crushed it. Soldiers became model gentlemen, no longer foraging but paying for what they wanted or needed. Sherman had his favorite regimental band present a concert for the city and brought supply ships from the north to help the city and its people gain or regain a sense of normalcy. In escaping Savannah, several Confederate generals left their families to Sherman's personal protection. Sherman took the responsibility very seriously. It was a strange end to a very destructive month. When Sherman started, he told Confederates that as long as they continued their resistance, he would make them pay dearly, but that the process would stop when they quit the fight. As soon as the mayor of Savannah surrendered the city, that's what happened. When it came to march through the Carolinas, states still in rebellion, destructive war returned. South Carolina gets it worse than Georgia because that's where secession started. And Sherman's soldiers said, by God, this is where it's going to end. Sherman demanded surrender and would accept nothing less. His men tore through South Carolina. North Carolina suffered less because it was not viewed as responsible for the war like South Carolina had been. When Joseph E. Johnston surrendered at Durham Station, North Carolina, in August of 1865, Sherman offered a peace plan lenient enough that it caused many in the North to question his loyalty. Sherman basically follows what Grant did at Appomattox. It was a final iteration of his campaign to show mercy immediately upon surrender. The march to the sea demonstrates that Sherman wanted to wage a war that did not result in countless deaths. He saw destruction of property as less onerous than casualties, but more effective. It is estimated that during the 6-week march to the sea, Less than 3,000 casualties resulted. Compared to other battles, the month-long March to the Sea is relatively bloodless. However, the march is remembered to this day in the South as barbarism defined. Sherman successfully fought a psychological war of destruction. He entered the Confederate psyche and remains there to this day. Battle of Cedar Creek, another important battle, takes place on October 19th. In the fall of 1864, Major General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Army of the Shenandoah, marched up the Shenandoah Valley, stripping it bare to starve out Confederate forces in Virginia. By mid-October, Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal Early and his exhausted Army of the Valley seemed near the breaking point. Though outnumbered 2-1, Early launched a daring attack that could drive the Union into the lower valley and reverse Confederate fortunes in 1864. After an audacious night march, Early's troop forded the North Fork of the Shenandoah River and attacked near Cedar Creek. Morning fog aided the smaller Confederate force, concealing their numbers and causing confusion in the Union ranks. The Confederates drove 3 Union corps from their camps near Cedar Creek across Belle Grove Plantation, then north of Middletown. As the sun came up, it looked as if the Confederates had won an astounding victory. However, with success came problems. The fog that had shielded their advance also caused Confederate units to become jumbled in the aftermath of the morning assault. Many soldiers in Early's army were starving, and for some, the abandoned Union camps where food and supplies were abundant presented the perfect opportunity to fill their stomachs and their haversacks. Untold numbers of Confederates fell out of the ranks to pilfer the Union camp. By midday, Early required considerable time to reorganize his force for a final crushing blow. Word of the battle reached Sheridan, who was 20 miles away at Winchester. He saddled his horse, Rienzi, and rode furiously to Cedar Creek, rallying stragglers along the way. His arrival restored the spirits of the Union troops, who, Sheridan said, would be back in their camps by nightfall. At 4 in the afternoon, the reorganized Union launched a savage counterattack for which Early's men were ill prepared and could not recover. During the afternoon, the Confederates were forced to yield the very ground, that they had captured in the morning 12 hours before. As the sun set, the Union had not only regained the ground that they lost, but extinguished any hope of further Confederate offenses in the Shenandoah Valley. It's here when Lincoln gets a telegram. Sheridan, I believe, was about 5'2", and Lincoln gets a telegram of Sheridan's success. He sends Sheridan a response and says, "I always thought that 5'8" was the right size for a general, but I guess 5'2" will do in a pinch." On January 15th, 1865, Wilmington, North Carolina, a haven for Confederate blockade runners, is captured by Union Admiral David Porter and a ground force under Union General Alfred Terry captures Fort Fisher in Wilmington. On the 31st of January, 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery is passed by Congress. Of course, it won't come into action until after Lincoln's assassination. On February 3rd, 1865, Lincoln meets with Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens to discuss peace. Lincoln has three conditions. One, restoration of the national authority throughout all the states. Two, the end of slavery. Three, the complete end of war and disbanding of all forces hostile to the federal government. Stephens says, I can't do it. Lincoln says, see you later. We'll end with Sherman's Carolinas campaign. Sherman and Grant met after the fall of Atlanta to develop a strategy for the remainder of the war in the East. Sherman had successfully accomplished the first part of the plan when he reached Savannah at the end of his march to the sea in December 1864. Next, Sherman won Grant's approval for a similar overland march through the Carolinas with his 60,000-man army, destroying the Confederates' ability and will to fight. Opposing Sherman was Johnston's Army of the Tennessee, with less than one-third of Sherman's strength. Braxton Bragg led a smaller Confederate force in North Carolina. Sherman's Carolinas campaign began at the end of January 1865. Major General Oliver Howard commanded the Army of Tennessee, with the 15th and 17th Corps comprising Sherman's right wing, while Major General Henry Slocum led the Army of Georgia with the 14th and 20th Corps making up Sherman's left wing. In the center, Major General John Schofield commanded the Army of the Ohio with the 23rd and 10th Corps. Slocum and Howard would move from Savannah toward Columbia, so those are the left and right wings, while Schofield in the center would press inland from the North Carolina coast against Bragg. Sherman's men marched through South Carolina, destroying infrastructure as they converged on the state capital of Columbia, capturing it on February 17, 1865. Columbia's surrender led to the abandonment of Charleston on the coast, the birthplace of secession. After fighting a fire that destroyed the city, Sherman marched out of Columbia and continued north toward Goldsboro, North Carolina, with his men destroying the railroad as they marched. The fall of the port city of Wilmington meant Sherman would have a base of supplies waiting for him as he advanced north. On March 3rd, Sherman entered North Carolina. Days later, Confederates under Bragg and Major General Wade Hampton conducted small offenses at Wise Fork and Monroe's Crossroads with little effect. March 15th and 16th, 1865, Federal cavalry and infantry engaged the Confederates under Major General William Hardee near Averisboro. Though a Confederate defeat, the action delayed Sherman for Johnston to bring his army to Bentonville, where, after fighting from March 19th through March 21st in North Carolina's largest battle, the Confederates were defeated in the last major battle of the war. On the 18th of April, so this is a couple of weeks after Appomattox and just 3 days after Lincoln is assassinated and he dies, on the 18th of April, Johnston and Sherman signed an armistice to end the fighting. On April 26th, Johnston formally surrendered his army to Sherman at Bennett Place, just outside of Raleigh. And that is where we are going to end today. As a reminder, our new schedule, we are going to have History for Shut-ins on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them here, and I will be happy to answer them. Leave them on the Facebook page. Feel free to share our information with family and friends. and we will see you next Wednesday. Thanks for joining. Have a good rest of the week. Take care.